Landmark rulings are expected this week on several historic cases of exploitation in Ecuador. Agricultural workers say they've suffered decades of abuse on plantations producing plant fiber for the Japanese company Furukawa. And now the courts are set to decide on criminal sanctions and reparations. DW's Latin America correspondent Nicole reports.
If you look at the extra bend in his leg, you can see José Clemente Chavez lives in pain. He broke it while working on a plantation and says his employer didn't give him proper medical care. He was operating a machine like this when the abaca fibers he was processing caught his leg. The injuries from that and other accidents left him disabled, but he says the Japan-based company Furukawa, which exported the product, never compensated him. He says there was little consideration for safety and no support for those who were injured.
With my legs, I only feel like I'm half alive. When you're incapacitated, they pretend to not know you anymore. And they don't help at all because they don't know you. You're not worth anything if you say you're incapacitated. That's the thing about Furukawa.
Chavez is from Ecuador's Santo Domingo region. He's just one of 338 workers from across the country who are suing the company in court. The accusations include negligence, lack of safe working conditions, healthcare and clean drinking water. It's a huge case, which also includes claims of child labor and modern slavery. Susana Quiñones says she started working here when she was just 6 years old and spent decades in inhumane conditions. She told us she gave birth to 7 children on the plantation with no medical care.
It was very tough. We had to work during pregnancy with our big bellies. We got used to it. Sometimes we'd be working with the fibre right up until birth pains started.
Lacking maternal leave, she and other women got back to work directly after birth. Former workers show us how they would harvest the abaca for turning into rope, paper and fibres. They claim not only was it dangerous, they usually had no breaks or days off. If they didn't work, they wouldn't be paid. Campaigners say more than 80% of the workers live in extreme poverty. Ecuador's government testified during the trial against Furukawa. This is what the labor minister told us.
Previous governments, including the Ministry of Labor, didn't stop the situation that, from my point of view, is one of the most emblematic because here we are talking about slave labor. In the case of Furukawa, it was all there.
Abaca exporter Furukawa's current manager insists the workers always had social security and medical care, but he says responsibility for those things was partly in the hands of local contractors until 2018.
The company could have had a closer relationship with the contractors to find out if there were problems while processing the fibre. That is something that could have been improved. But to speak about slavery is very, very, very far-fetched.
The workers say they lost childhoods, education and health.
We have suffered at this company, so we demand justice. At the end of the day, the judges too are fathers and mothers.
Those judges in the penal court and the constitutional court could make historic decisions, setting out responsibility and accountability for workers' rights in Ecuador.
Now, as we've mentioned, the cases are also about forced labor here, and I'd like to talk about that aspect with Joanna Ewart-James, co-founder of Freedom United, an organization dedicated to ending human trafficking and modern slavery, and also chair of the board of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. A very warm welcome to DW. Let's put this into perspective for our viewers. What would you say the likelihood is that somebody who is watching from home has unknowingly bought a product that was made using forced labor?
Thank you very much for having me today. The likelihood is sadly very high that you or I indeed have bought something that's produced with forced labor, because this is a crime that is endemic, it is global, and it is in the supply chains of many of the everyday products that we buy from supermarkets, from retailers, and also on occasions from services. So I would say the chances are much smaller that we haven't used a product that has been produced at some point with exploitation or slavery.
And what are some of the industries where you see the greatest abuses in this regard?
Modern slavery and forced labor is affecting a range of manufacturing and agricultural industries. Our map, .freedomunited.org, is interactive, and you can go and see that where cotton is produced in countries where it is with a high likelihood of forced labor, such as in China, in the Uyghur region, and coffee. Then there's heavy metals. We know, of course, about the conditions in Eastern Congo, where children are and adults are forced to mine goods that go into electronics. There is a long list. I definitely encourage anyone to look into it, to just learn and understand exactly how forced labor enters into our supply chains and into the goods that we are so commonly rely upon in our day-to-day life.
And the ILO says 28 million men, women, and children around the world are experiencing forced labor. It's just a staggering number. What has to go wrong for us to see a number that is so high?
I think it is staggering, absolutely. And that number is looking to be increasing. The estimations are estimations, so I think realistically it could be a lot more. Why are we seeing an increase today? Well, people are in situations of exploitation because they are vulnerable. That means that they're taking greater risks. That means that somebody is exploiting that vulnerability to benefit from, for the most part, their labor, especially, of course, in the cases of forced labor. And how does that vulnerability emerge? That's a key question. And I can point to some of the changes that we've seen in recent times that explains why some people are more vulnerable. The ILO itself, the International Labour Organization, pointed out that there is a real need to focus on ensuring that there are safe routes for migrants. We need more safe, regular routes for migrants so that they are not squeezed into situations where they may take a risk, take an opportunity that actually turns out to be exploitative. Also, with the economic challenges that we've had recently and the high inflation, people are squeezed into places where they take risks that they wouldn't otherwise normally take. And this increases their vulnerability to forced labor. And that's, I think, we're seeing in the increased numbers in the estimates.
Joanna Ewart-James, thank you so much for your time today on DW News.
Thank you.
And Francisco Hurtado volunteered for a committee representing many of the victims. He joins us now. Francisco, welcome to DW. We heard some accounts there in the report, but just from what you've been hearing and from what people have been telling you, what have victims gone through in their work and their fight for justice?
Good morning, Nicole. Thank you for having me. Yeah, that's an important question because the Japanese company have been operating for a century, from 1914 in the Philippines and the last 6 decades in Ecuador. And in 2012, Mabenz Inc., another Japanese company, bought Furukawa. So it's important to say that in Ecuador, the company owns 2,300 hectares of land with several ruined and crowded encampments, as we are seeing in the video, where entire families have been living, not just working, but living inside the plantations without water, energy, and sanitation, most of them illiterate, without access to adequate health and education, and earning meager income. It means in absolute poverty and hyper-exploitation while harvesting the abaca fiber exclusively for the company. This is important because the CEO of the company repeatedly say that it's just an isolated case. They weren't their workers. They have social security, but all these abacaleros, they have been harvesting the abaca exclusively for this company for decades. It's not a matter of years. It's 6 decades, and in the whole time, nobody has contracts. Nobody have access to any basic services. So all these have configured a prohibited contemporary form of slavery, named serfdom by the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the Slave Trade, and institutions and practices similar to slavery.
And when they decided to speak up,
is,
they were harassed, right? They were harassed and intimidated.
Yeah, at some point they started to field complaints before the Ministry of Labor, but in individually cases, right? So they finally overcome fear. First of all, they overcome retaliations, as you said. And in 2019, they denounced it publicly. It's 2018, actually, when they denounced publicly these conditions and they started a collective action. This ended in this Ombudsman Office of Ecuador report, a human rights report. I was serving there as a first deputy in that institution and revealed these conditions in this report. So it was like 40 people together. They went to the Ministry of Labor, to the Ministry of Homeland Security, and to the Ombudsman Office of Ecuador to denounce it. And after that, with the support of the Solidarity Committee, they feel this complaint is a human rights case. It's not a labor judicial process. It's human rights before that now it's on the Constitutional Court, the National Constitutional Court of Ecuador.
What do you expect from the courts now?
So that's the thing. We had the final hearing 2 months ago, maybe 1 month, 2 months ago. So abacaleros are demanding an expedited rule. We need an expedited rule. 6 abacaleros already passed away while waiting for justice. So we're asking 2 things. First of all, it's reparations for the abacaleros. Now they are almost 430 people as a plaintiffs in the Constitutional Court, and we're asking reparations. A judge in first instance, he ruled that each of them deserves 5 hectares of land and an economic compensation. And on the other hand, we're asking non-repetition measures. That means that the Ministry of Labor should have an inspectorate specifically dedicated to eradicate these forms of slavery, child labor, and hyper-exploitation in agricultural lands, mainly for exportation. In 2010, the special rapporteur on this matter of the United Nations, they find this type of work, this type of slavery, serfdom, not just like in several plantations in Ecuador, particularly bananas and flowers. Yeah. So Furukawa case is not an isolated case in that sense.
Yeah. That was Francisco Hurtado with the Committee for Solidarity for Furukawa Workers. Thank you so much for sharing the details of your struggle and for your time.
Thank you for this interview.
Let's bring in Fernanda Hopenhaym Cabrera. She's the vice chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and is following this case very closely. Fernanda, 2 landmark court cases in Ecuador. What do you expect from these rulings?
Thank you. Well, from the working group perspective, what we expect is, first of all, to have a clear ruling that sets what's the responsibility of the company, as well as, of course, of the authorities, particularly the labor authorities in Ecuador. We think it's very important that this ruling clarifies whether we're really talking about modern slavery or forced labor in the case of these workers. And again, what has been the responsibility of the company in Ecuador? And hopefully that can also lead to the responsibilities of the parent company in Japan, which I think it's important to be clarified as well.
Now, these cases are, of course, about human rights and accountability. How much of a difference can the court's decisions make?
Well, I do think, and this is the perspective of the working group, that, of course, any ruling coming from such a high court, as in the case of Ecuador, can set precedent in terms of, again, clarifying the responsibilities of companies with regards to human rights. For decades, we have discussed the, of course, obligations and the duties of the states to protect human rights. But since, the guiding principles on business and human rights were adopted in the UN in 2011, we have been making a lot of emphasis on the responsibility also of companies or private actors to respect human rights and make sure that there isn't forced labor or any form of modern slavery in their supply chains.
Now, this is one case that we're looking at, but can you give us a sense of how big the problem of modern slavery is today and what's driving it?
Well, there are definitely commercial drivers. We see this in the agricultural sector, in the extractive sector, in industries that really operate in long scales and portions of territory, extracting or producing, natural resources, food, etc. And this is partially because of the demand to produce certain amounts per day. So this many times corners workers to work very, very long hours, including bringing their children and the whole family to the plantations to be able to collect and fulfill the demands from the company or from the third parties that are intermediaries with the companies. So I think there is really a problem nowadays with the demand that it's put on workers, mostly on poor workers from vulnerable and historically excluded communities, including communities of colors, indigenous communities in the global south, in Latin America, in Africa, and certain countries in Asia, to reach those marks in terms of production. And I think this is actually a problem of the system, of the business model itself.
That was the United Nations' Fernanda Hopenhaym Cabrera. Thank you so much, Fernanda.
My pleasure. Thank you.